In 1878, workers excavating burial mounds along the Ohio River made a discovery that would shock America and be quickly buried by the Smithsonian Institution. Skeletons measuring between 7 and 9 feet tall, with elongated skulls, double rows of teeth, and bones twice as thick as normal humans. Newspapers across the country reported finding giant skulls so large they could fit over a normal man's head like a helmet. These weren't scattered anomalies, but evidence of an entire civilization, the mound builders, who constructed thousands of enormous earthworks aligned with celestial events, who traded obsidian from thousands of miles away, who performed elaborate burial rituals with red ochre powder symbolizing eternal life, and who mysteriously vanished around 500 CE. Dr. J.L. West documented burial chambers where these tall people sat on stone thrones, surrounded by copper plates carved with strange animals, and necklaces made from thousands of bear teeth. But within decades, the skeletal evidence disappeared into Smithsonian storage, mounds were destroyed for urban development, and official history claimed the mound builders were normal-sized Native Americans. This is the forbidden story of the Ohio River Titans, told through 1800s newspaper reports, archaeological records, and the strange customs that suggest an advanced civilization was deliberately erased from history. The year 1878 marked the golden age of American archaeology, when the young nation was obsessed with uncovering its mysterious past. Along the Ohio River Valley, thousands of massive earthen mounds dotted the landscape, mysterious monuments that early European settlers couldn't explain. Who built them? When? And most puzzling, why? The Ohio River Valley contained the highest concentration of these mounds in North America. Some were small burial mounds, others were massive geometric earthworks spanning hundreds of acres. The most famous, the Great Serpent Mound, stretched over 1,300 feet in the shape of a snake swallowing an egg. These weren't natural formations, but deliberate constructions requiring millions of hours of coordinated labor. In spring 1878, a team led by Dr. J.L. West began excavating a large burial mound near the Ohio River in what is now West Virginia. They expected to find artifacts and perhaps some skeletal remains of the mysterious mound builders that would help explain who these ancient engineers had been. What they found exceeded all expectations and challenged fundamental assumptions about ancient America. As they carefully removed layers of earth, they uncovered a burial chamber constructed of stone slabs. Inside lay skeletal remains that were immediately recognizable as human, but of extraordinary size. The skeleton measured over 7 feet tall, with bones that were proportionally thicker and denser than normal human bones. The skull was elongated, with a cranial capacity significantly larger than modern humans. And most remarkably, when they examined the jaw, they found 2 complete rows of teeth, a double dentition that seemed anatomically impossible. Dr. West meticulously documented the find. His notes described the skeleton's position, seated upright on what appeared to be a stone throne, surrounded by grave goods including copper plates, shell beads, and carved pipes. The burial chamber had been sealed with a type of cement-like substance that had preserved the remains remarkably well. Word of the discovery spread quickly. The New York Times published a report on December 20th, 1878, describing the find and noting that several such giant skeletons had been discovered in Ohio mounds that year. The article mentioned skulls so large that a normal man's head could fit inside like wearing a helmet. Local residents flocked to see the excavation. Many were frightened by the giant bones, which seemed to confirm old legends about a race of giants who had once inhabited the land. Some Native American elders weren't surprised. Their oral tradition spoke of tall people who had lived in the region long ago, before their ancestors arrived. The excavation continued, revealing more giant skeletons in the same mound. Some were buried alone in elaborate chambers, others were grouped together in mass graves. The variation in burial treatment suggested a hierarchical society where some individuals received special treatment in death. One of the most puzzling aspects was the depth of the burials. While typical Native American burials from known tribes were shallow, these giant skeletons were found 10 to 15 feet deep in carefully constructed chambers lined with stone. The effort required to dig so deep with primitive tools was enormous, suggesting these burials were reserved for people of great importance. The artifacts buried with the giants were sophisticated. Copper plates hammered into intricate designs, thousands of shell beads that must have taken years to craft, pipes carved into animal shapes with remarkable artistry. These weren't the possessions of primitive people, but of a culture with advanced metalworking, long-distance trade networks, and artistic traditions. Dr. West arranged for several skeletons to be carefully packaged and shipped to the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C., where they could be properly studied and preserved. He believed these finds would revolutionize understanding of ancient American history. But something strange happened to those bones once they reached the Smithsonian. They were cataloged, examined briefly, and then they disappeared. They weren't displayed publicly, weren't written about in official publications, and when researchers later asked about them, they were told no such specimens existed. The 1878 discovery was just the beginning. Over the next several decades, hundreds of similar giant skeleton discoveries would be reported across the Ohio Valley, each time generating newspaper headlines and public excitement. And each time, the physical evidence would mysteriously vanish, leaving only old newspaper clippings and the memories of those who had witnessed the finds. The suppression of this evidence raises troubling questions. Why would institutions dedicated to preserving history actively hide it? What was so threatening about giant skeletons that they needed to be erased from the archaeological record? And what can we learn about the mound builders from the evidence that survived? Based on archaeological evidence that survived institutional suppression, the mound builder civilization represents one of the most sophisticated cultures in ancient North America. They weren't primitive hunter-gatherers, but organized societies with advanced engineering, astronomy, and social hierarchies. The term mound builders actually encompasses several related cultures that flourished in the Ohio Valley between approximately 1000 BCE and 500 CE. The earliest were the Adena people, followed by the more elaborate Hopewell culture. What united them was their practice of constructing massive earthen monuments. These weren't simple burial mounds, but complex structures that served multiple purposes. Some were burial sites for the elite, others were ceremonial centers, still others appear to have been astronomical observatories, aligned with solstices, equinoxes, and stellar events. The precision of these alignments suggests sophisticated knowledge of celestial mechanics. The villages of the mound builders were organized in patterns that seem deliberately planned. Circular arrangements with central plazas, geometric layouts that mirror celestial patterns, and strategic positioning near rivers for trade and transportation. This wasn't random settlement, but intentional urban planning. One of the most remarkable aspects of mound builder culture was their sacred pathways, straight earthen causeways that connected mounds across vast distances, sometimes spanning hundreds of miles. These pathways were precisely aligned and maintained, suggesting they served important ceremonial or administrative functions, connecting different centers of population. The relationship between physical stature and social status appears to have been fundamental to mound builder society. The tallest individuals received the most elaborate burials in the largest mounds, surrounded by the finest grave goods. This suggests height was either a marker of elite lineage or that tall individuals were selected for leadership positions. But these weren't just unusually tall individuals within a normal population. The skeletal evidence suggests an entire population with average heights far exceeding modern humans. While the general population may have averaged 6 to 6.5 feet, the elite class apparently reached 7 to 9 feet, with proportions that remained humanly normal despite the increased size. The isolation of these tall people from other Native American groups is evident in the archaeological record. Their burial customs, architectural styles, and material culture were distinct from the tribes that later inhabited the region. They weren't the ancestors of the historical tribes like the Shawnee or Miami, but a separate population that predated them. The Adena culture, the earliest identifiable mound builders, showed sophistication that contradicted theories of linear cultural evolution. From their first appearance around 1000 BCE, they were already constructing elaborate earthworks, working copper and mica, and engaging in long-distance trade. They didn't gradually develop these capabilities, but seemed to possess them from the beginning. The Hopewell culture that followed was even more elaborate. They created massive geometric earthworks, circles, squares, and octagons, with such precise measurements that modern surveyors are impressed by their accuracy. Some of these earthworks enclosed areas larger than Egyptian pyramids, yet were constructed entirely by human labor moving earth in baskets. Trade networks extended across North America. Obsidian from the Rocky Mountains, copper from Lake Superior, shells from the Gulf Coast, mica from the Appalachians, all found their way to Ohio Valley mounds. This required sophisticated systems of communication, transportation, and exchange spanning thousands of miles. The agricultural practices of the mound builders were advanced but unusual. They cultivated native crops like sunflowers, goosefoot, and maygrass, but they also seemed to practice sophisticated forest management, creating orchards of useful trees. Their diet, based on isotope analysis of surviving bones, was diverse and protein-rich. Their artistic traditions showed remarkable skill. Carved pipes depicting animals were so realistic that species could be identified. Copperwork demonstrated advanced metallurgy, with techniques for annealing and forming that wouldn't be rediscovered in the region for centuries. Textiles, though rarely preserved, showed complex weaving patterns. The ceremonial life of the mound builders was elaborate and apparently central to their culture. Massive earthworks served as gathering places for seasonal ceremonies that might have drawn thousands of people. The labor required to build these monuments suggests a society capable of mobilizing and feeding large populations for extended periods. But perhaps the most intriguing aspect is what they didn't have. No evidence of fortifications or defensive works during their early period. This suggests a time of relative peace, when they could invest enormous resources in ceremonial architecture, rather than military defenses. This peaceful period apparently ended catastrophically, as we'll see in later chapters. The mound builders remain mysterious, partly because their descendants didn't preserve written records of their history. The oral traditions of later tribes sometimes reference tall, ancient people, but the details are fragmentary. The physical monuments remain, scattered across the Midwest, silent testimonies to a sophisticated civilization that flourished and then vanished. The burial customs of the mound builders reveal a complex belief system centered on death, rebirth, and the journey to an afterlife. These weren't simple interments, but elaborate rituals that required extensive preparation and demonstrated beliefs about what happened after death. The most distinctive burial practice was what archaeologists call layered burial. In major mounds, bodies weren't buried randomly, but were carefully arranged in distinct layers, with different levels apparently reserved for different status groups or time periods. The deepest burials, requiring the most effort to construct, were the most elaborate. Red ochre powder played a central role in burial rituals. This iron oxide mineral was ground into fine powder and liberally spread over bodies, burial chambers, and grave goods. Some skeletons were so thoroughly coated that they appeared red when excavated. The red color apparently symbolized blood, life, and rebirth. The deceased would be reborn in the spirit world. The practice of partial cremation was particularly mysterious. Some bodies were partially burned before burial, with careful burning of specific body parts while leaving others intact. The skull and long bones were often burned, while the torso remained unburned, or vice versa. This selective burning suggests ritual significance rather than practical purpose. Some burial chambers contained individuals seated upright on stone thrones or benches, positioned as if presiding over the afterlife. These seated burials were always the tallest individuals, suggesting they were leaders or religious figures. The labor required to construct these stone seats and burial chambers was enormous, indicating these were people of great importance. Evidence of sacrificial practices exists, but is controversial. Some mounds contained the remains of multiple individuals buried simultaneously, with some bodies showing signs of trauma, suggesting they may have been sacrificed to accompany the primary deceased. Animal remains, particularly dogs, were frequently included, possibly as companions or guides for the journey to the afterlife. Human sacrifice remains debated among archaeologists. Some skeletons show evidence of ritual killing, specific trauma patterns not consistent with warfare or accident. In a few cases, hands were found crossed and bound, suggesting these individuals were restrained. But whether these represent sacrifice, punishment, or some other practice remains unclear. The belief in an afterlife connected to the stars was evident in the astronomical alignments of major mounds. The constellation Orion appears to have been particularly significant, with some earthworks aligning with Orion's belt. This stellar connection suggests the mound builders believed the deceased traveled to the stars, or that the stars represented the realm of ancestors. Grave goods varied dramatically by status, but followed consistent patterns. Elite burials contained copper plates, shell beads, carved pipes, and mica sheets. The copper plates often featured designs of animals, particularly birds, serpents, and humans with elaborate headdresses, suggesting these images had spiritual significance. The carved stone pipes found in burials were masterpieces of ancient art. Shaped like animals, eagles, bears, panthers, otters, these pipes were so realistic that zoologists can identify species. The pipes were apparently used to smoke tobacco or other plants in ceremonies, and burying them with the deceased suggests these rituals continued in the afterlife. Mica played a mysterious role in burial customs. Thin sheets of this shiny mineral were placed in burial chambers, on bodies, or incorporated into earthwork architecture. When light entered the burial chamber, the mica would create a shimmering, reflective effect. This may have symbolized the threshold between the physical and spiritual worlds. Food and drink offerings were made at grave sites, though the organic materials have long since decomposed. Pottery vessels in consistent positions suggest standardized offering practices. Some burials included what appears to be prepared food, seeds, nuts, and grain that would sustain the deceased on their journey. The construction of mounds over burials was itself ritualistic. Earth was added in specific colored layers: dark soil, light soil, gravel, clay, creating striped patterns visible in archaeological cross-sections. Each layer may have represented a stage in the journey to the afterlife, or a prayer for the deceased. Reburial was practiced in some cases. Individuals were initially buried elsewhere, the flesh allowed to decompose, and then the bones were ceremonially reburied in mounds. This practice, called secondary burial, suggests beliefs about stages of death and the transformation of the physical body into spirit. The practice of killing grave goods, intentionally breaking pottery, bending copper plates, or defacing carved items before burial appears in some contexts. This ritual destruction may have released the spirit of the object, so it could accompany the deceased. Or it may have prevented grave robbery by making the items unusable. These elaborate burial customs suggest the mound builders invested enormous resources in death rituals, indicating strong beliefs about the afterlife and the continued existence of the deceased in spiritual form. Death wasn't an ending, but a transformation, and the living had obligations to ensure the deceased were properly equipped for their journey. The material culture of the mound builders demonstrates sophisticated craftsmanship and reveals a society with complex symbolism, long-distance trade, and specialized artisans. The artifacts weren't merely functional, but carried deep cultural and spiritual significance. Copper plates were among the most impressive artifacts. Hammered from nearly pure copper into thin sheets and embossed with intricate designs, these plates required advanced metalworking knowledge. The copper came from Lake Superior, over 500 miles away, and was worked using annealing techniques, repeated heating and hammering, that prevented cracking. The designs on copper plates featured recurring motifs: birds of prey with elaborate tail feathers, serpents with distinctive patterns, and humanoid figures wearing elaborate headdresses with curved elements. Some figures had what appeared to be wings or capes. These weren't random designs, but apparently represented important spiritual beings or elite individuals. Necklaces made from thousands of shell beads or animal teeth represent thousands of hours of labor. One burial contained a necklace with over 12,000 shell beads, each individually drilled and strung. Another featured bear teeth, hundreds of them, suggesting the wearer had killed many bears or had access to the teeth of many bears killed by others. Mica artifacts were particularly mysterious. This mineral, mined from the Appalachian Mountains, can be split into transparent sheets that shimmer when light passes through them. The mound builders cut mica into specific shapes: hands, birds, geometric patterns, creating translucent images that must have been stunning when backlit. The purpose of mica artifacts remains debated. Some were clearly worn as ornaments. Others were incorporated into architectural features, mica sheets placed in mound walls where they would catch light. The reflective, translucent quality may have symbolized the spirit world, or represented a boundary between physical and spiritual realms. Effigy pipes, carved stone pipes shaped like animals, represent the pinnacle of mound builder artistry. These small sculptures, typically 3 to 6 inches long, depicted animals with such accuracy that species, posture, and even behavior can be identified. A famous pipe shows an otter eating a fish, capturing a moment of natural behavior in stone. The pipes were functional. They had hollow chambers and channels for smoke, but they were also ceremonial objects. The animal shapes weren't decorative, but probably represented spiritual helpers or totems. Different pipes may have been used in different ceremonies or by individuals with particular spiritual connections to specific animals. Gold and silver artifacts were rare, but exquisitely crafted. Small amounts of these precious metals were formed into beads, thin plates, and decorative elements. The rarity of gold and silver in mound builder artifacts suggests they were reserved for the highest elites or most important ceremonial contexts. Obsidian artifacts provide evidence of trade networks spanning the continent. This volcanic glass came from sources in the Rocky Mountains, over 1,500 miles from Ohio. The mound builders fashioned obsidian into ceremonial blades, projectile points, and cutting tools. The long-distance trade required to obtain obsidian suggests complex networks of exchange. Some obsidian artifacts weren't functional, but purely ceremonial, too thin or delicate to use practically. These eccentric obsidian pieces were shaped into curves, points, and elaborate forms that required extraordinary knapping skill. They may have represented wealth or prestige, as the obsidian itself and the skill to work it were both valuable. Textiles rarely survive in archaeological contexts, but impressions on pottery and a few preserved fragments reveal sophisticated weaving. The mound builders created patterned fabrics with geometric designs, used plant fibers to make cordage of varying thicknesses, and possibly worked with animal furs to create elaborate garments. Stone beads of various materials, steatite, shell, copper, and semi-precious stones, were crafted in standardized sizes and shapes, suggesting specialized bead-making workshops. The uniformity of beads found across many mounds indicates either widespread trade in finished beads or shared cultural standards for bead production. Pottery vessels showed regional variations, but shared common forms: jars for storage, bowls for serving, and ceremonial vessels with elaborate decorations. Some pottery was so thin-walled that it seems impractical for daily use, suggesting these pieces were made specifically for burial or ceremonial purposes. Carved bone and antler artifacts included awls, needles, and decorative items. Some bone carvings featured the same motifs found on copper: birds, serpents, humanoid figures, suggesting a consistent symbolic vocabulary across different materials. The choice of material may have carried its own significance. Crystals and unusual stones were collected and sometimes worked into shapes. Clear quartz crystals, colorful agates, and other visually striking stones were placed in burials or incorporated into ceremonial objects. The mound builders clearly valued these materials for aesthetic or spiritual reasons beyond practical utility. These artifacts collectively demonstrate that mound builder society supported specialized artisans who dedicated their time to creating objects of beauty and ceremonial significance, rather than merely producing practical tools. This level of specialization requires agricultural surplus, social organization, and cultural values that prized artistic achievement. The physical characteristics of the mound builder skeletons, as documented in 19th century reports before the evidence disappeared, showed several features that distinguished them from both modern humans and known Native American populations. These anatomical differences were remarkable enough to generate extensive newspaper coverage and scientific debate. The most frequently reported anomaly was double rows of teeth. Multiple excavation reports from the 1870s to 1890s describe skeletons with two complete sets of teeth in both upper and lower jaws. This condition, while biologically possible in rare cases, appeared with unusual frequency in mound builder remains. Some reports suggested these double teeth were functional, not deformities. The dental arrangement described wasn't exactly two normal rows, but rather a configuration where teeth were arranged in double thickness, creating what appeared to be two rows. Some accounts described the teeth as being larger than normal human teeth, with molars particularly massive and showing unusual wear patterns, suggesting a diet different from surrounding tribes. Femur bones, the thigh bones, were reportedly twice as thick in diameter as normal human femurs, while maintaining proportional length. This extraordinary thickness would require bones of unusual density and strength, suggesting either genetic factors or perhaps environmental/dietary influences that built exceptional bone mass. The elongated skulls found in many burials weren't the result of artificial cranial modification, a practice where infants' heads are bound to create elongated shapes. The mound builder skulls showed natural elongation, with no evidence of the deformation patterns that cranial binding creates. The brain case was simply larger in all dimensions. These skulls had cranial capacities estimated at 1,500 to 1,800 cubic centimeters, significantly larger than the modern human average of 1,300 to 1,400 cubic centimeters. The larger brain case didn't create disproportionate appearance, but rather suggested these were simply scaled-up versions of normal human skulls. The implications of larger brain capacity were never officially addressed. Polydactyly, extra fingers and toes, appeared in skeletal remains and in carved representations. Some reports mentioned 6 digits on hands and feet. While polydactyly occurs in modern populations as a genetic variant, its apparent frequency in mound builder remains was notable. Carved hands on artifacts sometimes showed 6 fingers, suggesting this feature might have been culturally significant. Skull thickness was another consistent finding. The bone of the cranium was described as notably thicker than normal human skulls, sometimes twice the typical thickness. This robust skull construction would have provided exceptional protection against head trauma, though why such protection would be necessary remains unclear. Height reconstructions based on long bone measurements consistently placed the mound builder elite at 7 to 9 feet tall. The general population appeared to average 6 to 6.5 feet, still taller than typical Native American populations of the period. The height differential between elite and commoner burials suggests either genetic stratification or environmental factors that affected growth. Joint surfaces on long bones were described as unusually large and robust, consistent with bodies that were not only tall, but proportionally powerful. The muscle attachment points showed evidence of exceptional musculature, suggesting these were not merely tall, but physically very strong individuals. Rib cages were reportedly deeper, front to back, than typical human rib cages, suggesting larger lung capacity. This anatomical feature might have provided advantages in physical endurance or high-altitude environments, though the Ohio Valley isn't particularly high altitude, making this adaptation puzzling. Pelvic structures in female skeletons were proportionally larger, which would be expected in a generally larger population, but was specifically noted by 19th-century observers. The birth canal dimensions suggested these women gave birth to proportionally large infants, which would have implications for infant and maternal mortality rates. The vertebrae were described as unusually large and robust, with thick intervertebral spaces suggesting excellent spine health, even in elderly individuals. Some reports noted that even very old individuals showed minimal spinal degeneration, suggesting either genetic factors or lifestyle differences that protected spinal health. The nasal apertures in skulls were described as larger than typical, and some reports mentioned pronounced brow ridges, though not to the degree seen in archaic human species. These facial features gave the skulls a distinctive appearance that observers consistently noted as different from known populations. The condition of teeth in elderly individuals was often remarked upon. Many showed minimal decay or wear despite advanced age. This suggests either genetic resistance to dental disease or dietary factors that promoted dental health. The double dentition, if real, might have provided functional advantages in tooth longevity. These anatomical features, collectively, describe a population that was distinctly different from both modern humans and known Native American groups. Whether these differences represent genetic isolation, environmental adaptations, or something else entirely, remains debated among the few researchers who acknowledge the evidence existed. The consistency of descriptions across multiple excavation reports from different locations and time periods suggests these weren't fabrications or misidentifications, but genuine observations of an unusual population. The subsequent disappearance of the physical evidence makes verification impossible, but doesn't negate the documentary record. The mound builders achieved engineering feats that defy explanation. Without wheels, draft animals, or metal tools beyond copper, they moved millions of tons of earth to create monuments of extraordinary precision. Their technical knowledge suggests mathematical and astronomical sophistication that challenges all assumptions about Stone Age peoples. The Great Serpent Mound stretches 1,348 feet in perfect serpentine curves. Other mounds demonstrated advanced mathematics, perfect circles with calculated diameters, square earthworks with sides meeting at exact 90-degree angles. The geometric precision implies knowledge of principles like the Pythagorean theorem centuries before it was supposedly discovered. Astronomical alignments were built into major complexes. The Newark earthworks covered 4 square miles with circles and octagons aligned with the 18.6-year lunar standstill cycle, requiring decades of observation to understand. Mounds across the region aligned with equinoxes and solstices, with openings allowing sunlight to penetrate specific points only on certain days of the year. The largest mounds contained over 60,000 cubic meters of earth, all moved in woven baskets by human labor. Coordinating thousands of workers and maintaining precision over years of construction suggests organization beyond typical tribal societies. How did they manage such projects without written records or complex administrative systems? Copper working demonstrated metallurgy that wouldn't be matched for over 1,000 years. They mined pure copper from Lake Superior, 500 miles away, and worked it through annealing, repeatedly heating and hammering to make it workable. This requires understanding how temperature changes metal properties. The ancient cement in burial chambers puzzles modern engineers. Harder than surrounding stone, and apparently waterproof, it sealed chambers so effectively some remained airtight for centuries. Chemical analysis reveals mineral and organic mixtures, but the exact formula remains unknown. Sophisticated drainage systems prevented erosion through graded slopes, stone channels, and strategic vegetation. Many earthworks survive today, partly because of drainage design that has functioned for over a millennium without maintenance. Materials traveled vast distances without pack animals or wheels. Copper from Lake Superior, mica from Appalachians, obsidian from the Rockies, shells from the Gulf, all appeared in Ohio mounds. River transport seems logical, but no evidence of specialized vessels survives. Creating parallel walls hundreds of yards apart, maintaining exact angles, and aligning with astronomical phenomena required sophisticated surveying instruments. What tools they used remains unknown, but the results prove they existed. The civilization's rapid collapse around 500 CE erased this knowledge within generations. What catastrophe could destroy such deeply embedded engineering expertise so completely? The answer lies in understanding their violent end and the deliberate suppression of evidence by modern institutions. The mound builder civilization ended suddenly and violently around 500 CE. The peaceful society that had built monuments and traded across continents was destroyed, leaving abandoned earthworks that later tribes couldn't explain. Late-period skeletons show widespread warfare trauma, stone projectile points embedded in bones, crushed skulls from clubs, defensive injuries on forearms. These weren't isolated incidents, but systematic violence, suggesting organized conflict across the entire region. Mass graves containing dozens of bodies buried hastily without ceremony mark the final period. Bodies were thrown into pits, sometimes left exposed before burial, a stark contrast with earlier elaborate rituals. The abandonment of normal burial customs suggests crisis conditions where survival took priority over tradition. Defensive earthworks appear suddenly after centuries without fortifications. Circular walls surrounding villages, wooden palisades, and strategic hilltop positioning all indicate communities under constant threat. Why would a peaceful people who had never needed defenses suddenly require them? Oral traditions of several tribes reference conflicts with tall, ancient people. The Paiute told stories of fighting red-haired giants. The Iroquois speak of conflicts with tall people who occupied their lands first. The Delaware describe the Allegui, powerful people along the Ohio River who had to be defeated before they could settle the region. The pattern suggests catastrophic rather than gradual decline. Major centers were abandoned suddenly, with valuable artifacts left behind. Unusual unless people fled in crisis. The complete cultural break, with later tribes showing no continuity with mound builder customs, indicates civilization collapse rather than cultural evolution. Multiple factors likely contributed to the extinction. These could have devastated dense populations and permanent villages, particularly if new pathogens arrived through trade networks. But disease alone rarely causes complete cultural erasure. Climate change around 500 CE probably played a crucial role. Evidence suggests increased flooding along the Ohio River, with major centers showing flood damage. Crop failures from climate instability could cause famine, weaken populations, and trigger social collapse. The giant stature that gave them physical advantages may have become a liability. Larger bodies require more food, making giants vulnerable during extended conflicts or famines. Their centralized settlements could be besieged more easily than dispersed tribal peoples. The speed of collapse is most remarkable. Within a few generations, centuries of accumulated knowledge vanished. Astronomical observations, engineering techniques, metalworking skills, social organization, all disappeared so thoroughly that later inhabitants had no knowledge of who built the monuments. Thousands of mounds were destroyed in the 19th to 20th centuries, eliminating crucial evidence. Farmers leveled them for agriculture, cities built over sites, trophy hunters disturbed burials. Of thousands existing in 1800, most are gone today. By 900 CE, new peoples with completely different cultures occupied the region. The Mississippian culture built different mounds, practiced different customs, and showed no awareness of earlier civilization. The mound builders were utterly forgotten, except in silent monuments. Monuments that would puzzle Europeans centuries later, and whose evidence would be systematically suppressed by institutions meant to preserve history. The systematic suppression of giant skeleton evidence by the Smithsonian Institution represents one of archaeology's darkest chapters. Documented discoveries that should have revolutionized understanding of ancient America were instead hidden, destroyed, or officially denied. Between 1870 to 1900, hundreds of newspaper articles documented giant skeleton discoveries. The New York Times, Scientific American, and local papers published detailed excavation accounts. Many explicitly stated skeletons were sent to the Smithsonian for preservation. When researchers later inquired, they were told none existed. The Smithsonian claimed no giant skeletons had been received, or that reports were exaggerated. The physical evidence had vanished. Internal 1894 Smithsonian correspondence referenced anomalous skeletal remains, raising difficult questions. Some specimens were kept in storage pending resolution of theoretical conflicts, then disappeared entirely. The conflict centered on Darwin's evolution and assumptions about Native Americans. Giant skeletons with unusual features contradicted the model that all Native Americans descended from Asians crossing the Bering Strait. Mound builder sophistication challenged 19th century racial theories, classifying Native Americans as primitive. Cyrus Thomas's 1894 report stated mounds were built by normal-sized ancestors, and giant accounts were exaggerated. This became official position, despite contradicting field reports from the Bureau's own archaeologists. Dr. Aleš Hudlička, 1903 to 1942, aggressively suppressed anomalous findings, publicly ridiculing anyone claiming giant skeleton discoveries and blocking publication in reputable journals. Thousands of mounds were destroyed under development guise. Some researchers suspect certain mounds were deliberately targeted for containing problematic evidence. The controversy raises fundamental questions about scientific integrity. Science should welcome anomalous data, Instead, suppression suggests institutional interests override scientific principles. The most detailed records come from 19th century newspapers. Critics dismiss them as sensationalized, but consistency across independent sources suggests substantial truth. The mound builders weren't isolated, but part of a global pattern. European megalithic sites like Stonehenge show similarities: astronomical observatories, celestial alignments, sophisticated mathematics. Stonehenge builders were also notably tall. The serpent motif appears worldwide: Britain, Mexico, Ohio. Whether universal symbolism or ancient contact remains contested. Roman and Greek accounts describe lands to the west with tall inhabitants. Haplogroup X, a Middle Eastern/European genetic marker, appears in ancient American remains. Unexpected if all came via Bering Strait. Trade networks mirror Old World patterns. Moving materials vast distances suggests spiritual rather than practical purposes. Megalithic cultures worldwide declined 500 to 1000 CE. Ohio mound builders, British megalithic cultures, others. Global timing suggests climate change or other worldwide factors. Ancient texts universally reference giants: Biblical Nephilim, Greek Titans, Norse Jotun, Hindu Danavas. The universality across unrelated cultures is remarkable. Mound builder sophistication matched or exceeded Old World civilizations of the same period, challenging assumptions about American isolation before Columbus. DNA analysis of rare preserved specimens reveals surprising results. The most significant finding: haplogroup X2A in ancient American remains, including the mound builder period. Haplogroup X is found primarily in Europe, Middle East, and North Africa, not Asia. Its presence in ancient America was unexpected and controversial. Typical Native American haplogroups, A, B, C, D, have clear Asian origins, supporting Bering Strait migration. Haplogroup X represents a distinct lineage that doesn't fit this pattern. Some researchers suggest it represents separate migration from Europe or Middle East during the Ice Age. Its concentration in the Great Lakes area, where mound builders flourished, suggests either later arrival or severe population bottlenecks. The Smithsonian's continued refusal to make specimens available for modern analysis perpetuates controversy. The final truth must be assembled from fragments: 19th century newspapers, surviving earthworks, limited reports, rare genetic samples, oral traditions. History is written by those controlling narratives. The mound builder's story was buried because it didn't fit prevailing theories. The monuments remain, silent witnesses to a vanished civilization that mainstream archaeology won't acknowledge, but can't explain away.